On November 2nd, Sergeant Ortega found another large bay while he was leading a hunting party. Father Crespi wrote about it. It is a very large and fine harbor, such that not only all of the navy of our most Catholic Majesty, the King of Spain, but those of all Europe could take shelter in it. So for a while, I've wanted to do something about the Portolá Expedition. The Portolá Expedition was the first Spanish land exploration of the California coast, and it led to the discovery of the San Francisco Bay. And so I've really wanted to talk about this because if you've been following the show, we just recently did an episode on Baja California, and that was really interesting with David Keir. So I also wanted to understand a little bit about how the upper part, what is today the U.S. state of California, was really kind of explored and mapped. And so that really happened with the Portolá Expedition. So let's get into it and talk a little bit about it. What I'm going to say today is based on an article that I wrote for CaliforniaFrontier.net, our website, and you can go find that there. So to begin, you have to realize that for centuries, the Spanish Empire dominated trade between the Americas and the Far East. So especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, you had Spanish ships traveling across the Pacific, carrying goods on what was called the Manila Galleon between Acapulco and Manila, right? And especially beginning in the early 17th century, these galleons, these ships would stop along the coast of California, of what is today California, to rest, resupply with water, etc. But by the middle of the 18th century, Spain wasn't the dominant power in the Pacific. It found itself competing with other European empires for control of the Far East and the Pacific. And such was the case that in 1765, the King of Spain, Carlos III, decided to send a representative to New Spain, which today we would identify as Mexico and the parts of the U.S. that were Mexican territory, namely the Southwest California, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado, Utah, Texas, a lot. Anyway, he wanted to send a representative to New Spain to understand what was going on there and to strengthen Spanish power. And that man's name was José de Gálvez, and he was assigned as Inspector General. Okay? So, the Spanish had no permanent presence along the Pacific coast of what is today California. So Gálvez wanted to create a plan to establish a line of defense, that would extend from what is today Baja California, northern Baja California, up into Upper California, as it was known at the time. So his idea was to protect the Spanish territories, the territories that Spain had claimed, but wasn't really occupying, from being seized by other foreign powers, namely the British and the Russians. And in fact, the Russians already had a fur trade developing along Alaska's coast, and the Spanish rightly believed that they would eventually want to expand south into California. So just by way of making things clear, when I say, from here on in, when I say California, I'm going to be referring to Alta California, Upper California, what is today the U.S. state of California. But at the time, California, as you probably know, was really indicative of what is today Baja California. Now, apart from what the Russians were doing, the real threat to Spanish control of the Pacific was England, was the British Empire. And as a result of the 7 Years' War, which in the U.S. we call the French and Indian War, the English had really laid claim to being the most powerful nation in the world. They had obtained Canada from the French, and they had also acquired all of the Spanish territories in North America east of the Mississippi River. In the Pacific, they began to attack Spanish-controlled Manila. They took over the Philippines. They sacked Manila. And explorers like Commodore John Byron and Captain James Cook were exploring the oceans, the Pacific mainly, that Spain once dominated. So competition with empires such as Britain and Russia ultimately led to the Spanish moving and deciding to explore and colonize California. Now, in 1768, Francisco de Cuá, who was the viceroy of New Spain, and viceroy, the king's direct representative there, received a report, an urgent report from the Spanish Minister of State. And his message claimed that the Russians had already established a base somewhere in North America. So I'm going to quote here from his message. "The king has ordered me to inform your excellency of all that has just been set forth, so that you may make it known to the man appointed governor of California." And remember, California at this time meant Baja California. "Giving him instructions about the vigilance and care that you ought to exercise in order to observe such attempts as the Russians may make there, frustrating them if possible, so that you may report it to His Majesty." The viceroy passed the information on to Gálvez, who decided that this was the time to launch his plan. Now, a key aspect to his strategy, Gálvez's strategy, was to rediscover the port of Monterey. Now, the port of Monterey, or the Bay of Monterey, had been identified by Sebastián Vizcaíno, who went up the California coast in 1602. And he identified it as an excellent harbor for ships. But since 1602, the Spanish had never verified its location, right? They'd never set up a permanent settlement there, or had really tried to follow up by mapping it out. So what Gálvez decided was that it would be good to have sort of a two-pronged strategy to finally find Monterey Bay. And so the idea was a land expedition and a sea expedition north from Baja California. The first thing that they would do is seek out the port of San Diego, which had been identified by Cabrillo all the way back in 1542, and then later again by Vizcaíno in 1602. That was a little bit easier to find. And there they would establish both a mission and a presidio. So a mission to spread Christianity to the native people there, and then a presidio, which would be a fort, right? And they would do the same in Monterey, provided they found it. What Gálvez called this expedition was the Sacred Expedition, since it wasn't just a military effort, but the idea was to found missions as well. So, the person that Gálvez, decided to put in charge of this expedition was a man named Gaspar de Portolá, and he was the governor of California, Baja California, and he would be the expedition's commander. And so it was up to Portolá to organize two separate groups going by land and by sea. And then he divided each of those groups into two. So the group directly under his command was made up of 9 or 10 soldiers, leather jacket soldiers they were called, or in Spanish, soldados de cuera, because of the long leather, multi-layered leather jacket that they wore. And those jackets were heavy, but they really stopped both arrows and cactus spikes from penetrating and stabbing them. So anyway, 9 or 10 soldados de cuerda, 6 muleteers, mule drivers, 2 servants, and a man named Sebastián Tarabal, who was a native person from Baja California who would serve kind of as their guide. And Tarabal is very well known because he also later helped guide the Anza expedition, which came from the other direction to California in 1775-76. So Sergeant José Francisco de Ortega, very important figure in California history, served as Portolá's second in command, and Father Junípero Serra was assigned to oversee the religious portion of the journey, including the founding of the new missions. So the group left Loreto, which is on the southern end of Baja California, and it's where the southernmost mission in Baja California was, and still is there today, on March 9th of 1769. Now, because Father Serra had a wound or a bite, we're not sure what it was, but he had an infection in his leg that was really afflicting him, he had to delay his departure. And he wound up, going by mule and on foot and meeting up with the rest of the group on May 5th at the mission of Santa Maria, which is about 200 miles north of Loreto. And Father Serra there decided to found a new mission called San Fernando de Belicata, several miles north of Santa Maria. And he appointed another priest, Father Miguel de la Campa y Cos, as its administrator. And that is actually the first mission that Father Serra founded in the Californias. So sometimes we talk about 21 missions in California, but you could even say that the first one founded by the Franciscans, by Father Serra, was in Baja California in Belicata. So anyway, once they got going, the group arrived in San Diego on July 1st of 1769, which you could really say was the date of the establishment of Alta California. In the meantime, there's another group that Portolá established, and that was led by Captain Fernando de Rivera y Moncada, who was the commander of the Presidio at Loreto. And they set out on March 29th. So along with Rivera traveled Father Juan Crespi, another Franciscan, and he was the historian of the expedition, kept a diary, wrote things down. And along with them, there were 25 soldados de cuerda from the Presidio at Loreto, along with 42 native indigenous militiamen that Rivera had recruited several months earlier. So I think this is really interesting. So we have a whole group of Spanish soldiers, you have priests, Spanish priests, and you have natives from Baja California Indians who are serving as well on this expedition. Now, Rivera's portion of the group arrived in San Diego on May 15th, several weeks prior to when Portolá arrived, and that was partly because they were waiting for Junípero Serra. Now, the second prong, or the other prong of the expedition, was the sea one. And there were 2 ships that left from La Paz, Baja California, and headed to San Diego. The first was the San Carlos, which departed on January 9th. And on board of that ship was Engineer Miguel Constanzo, a very important figure in early California history, and Don Pedro Fages, also very important. and he was the lieutenant of the company of Catalonian volunteers, 25 of them. So soldiers, the original unit was from Catalonia in Spain, which is where Barcelona is the capital of Catalonia. And they traveled with Fages, and that journey on the San Carlos took more than 4 months. By the time the San Carlos arrived in San Diego on April 29th, the ship had experienced severe storms. It was leaking water, and many of the crew were suffering from scurvy. The second ship, the San Antonio, left La Paz on February 15th, much later. But unlike the San Carlos, it encountered favorable winds and was able to stop at an island in the Santa Barbara Channel where the crew actually received fish and fresh water from native people on the island. The San Antonio arrived at San Diego on April 11th, 1769, so weeks before the San Carlos. So they actually wound up setting up a field hospital to attend to the sick from the San Carlos when they arrived, and while they were waiting for the land expeditions to finally show up. Now, there was actually a third ship called the San Jose, which left for San Diego on June 16th, 1769. It had to turn back from repairs, and by the time it was repaired and departed again, it was May of 1770, almost a year later. But the ship, the San Jose, was lost at sea and never heard from again. So let's talk about the march to Monterey. So once all of the parties had successfully been reunited at San Diego, Portolá had orders to go up to Monterey, as we know, where they were to try and locate the port and establish a mission and a presidio. So he put together a company of 63 men made from the two groups, which included Father Juan Crespi, another priest named Francisco Gomez, engineer Constanzo, Pedro Fages, and 6 of his Catalonian volunteers, as well as Commander Rivera y Moncada, who was the commander of the Loreto Presidio, and Sergeant Ortega. Okay, that's sort of the leadership of the group. And then we had 26 soldiers, 7 muleteers, 15 of the natives from Baja California, and then 2 servants. Okay. They all left San Diego on July 14th of 1769. Constanzo described the men who set out from San Diego, and I'm going to quote here. Where is it? They are men of great strength, capable of bearing great fatigue, obedient, resolute, nimble, and we have no doubt in saying the best horsemen in the world. All right. And that's something that Californios, the people of Alta California in Spanish and Mexican times, really prided themselves on. Now, the journey was very well documented since Engineer Constanzo, Portolá himself, and Father Crespi all kept diaries. So you can read those diaries, and there's fantastic information in them. So once they set out north, they encountered numerous native people and villages, and most of those interactions were pleasant, right? And they traveled through numerous places and stopped at multiple places that they named that would actually become some of the most important cities in California. Los Angeles, for example. So on July 28th, they camped along a river they called the Santana, where they experienced multiple earthquakes, right? And by August 2nd, they reached the San Gabriel Valley, and they camped along another river, which they called La Porciúncula. La Porciúncula is a reference to the little church in Assisi in Italy, where St. Francis had his vision of Jesus Christ, who asked him to rebuild his church. So the Porciúncula was what they named that river after. Of course, the river would be later called the Los Angeles River. That's how we know it today. But as I mentioned, they experienced multiple earthquakes along the way. So on September 30th, after several weeks of marching overland, they actually arrived at the shore of Monterey Bay. But what Commander Portolá saw did not look like an enclosed port harbor like the one in San Diego or the fine harbor that Vizcaíno had described in 1602. What he did was he ordered his troops to continue north in hopes of actually discovering Monterey Bay. And this mistake was actually very fortuitous, because on November 2nd, Sergeant Ortega found another large bay while he was leading a hunting party. And Father Crespi wrote about it. Father Crespi was very impressed with it. And in his diary, he described it this way. And once again, I'm quoting here. It is a very large and fine harbor, such that not only all of the navy of our most Catholic Majesty, the King of Spain, but those of all Europe could take shelter in it. Portolá was actually disappointed at not finding Monterey, and this new bay, which they saw, this enormous, new, beautiful bay, he considered to be an obstacle to further exploration. That bay, as you probably guess, would later be named San Francisco. So they came across the San Francisco Bay while looking for Monterey. And in fact, there's a monument, and you can see a picture of it, marking the first Portolá camp after the discovery of San Francisco Bay in Millbrae, which is just south of the San Francisco airport. Now, by that time, their supplies were exhausted. So Portolá and his men made their way back to Monterey. And on December 9th, they began the return trip and reached San Diego, which by that time had a mission founded by Father Serra on January 24th, 1770. In fact, Father Serra, when he heard that they had not found Monterey, kind of sarcastically said, "So you came from Rome without having seen the Pope?" Now, as you can imagine, Portolá was not very happy at not completing his mission, and of course, being a little bit of a butt of a joke here. So they set out a second time on April 17th of 1770. But this time, they knew the route, and they were able to successfully identify the Monterey Bay. By May 24th, they set up a headquarters there, and Father Serra and Miguel Constanzo arrived on board the ship, the San Antonio, on May 31st, and soon they founded the mission, San Carlos Borromeo, which is there, and the Presidio. And those places became the important Spanish bases in the northern region of Alta California. So with that base established, Captain Fages, together with Father Crespi, began to explore the surrounding territory. And in November, they again came to the San Francisco Bay, but this time by traveling through the Santa Clara Valley, which is where today the city of San Jose is located. Now, 2 years later, Captain Fages and Father Crispy again traveled north to explore the San Francisco Bay region. And this time they crossed through the Salinas Valley, the Santa Clara Valley, and on their return, they actually became the first Europeans to view the great San Joaquin and Sacramento valleys, the great Central Valley of California. So these expeditions, these grueling expeditions, and I didn't go into very much detail about them, were really the key to establishing the Spanish presence in Alta California and effectively changed the course of North American, and you could even say world history. So if you'd like to know more, if you'd like to read this article, you can find it at www.californiafrontier.net. And as you know, there are plenty of resources about California history and links to other things that can be helpful, including our California history curriculum. So thanks again, and I'm happy to hear from you if you have any questions or observations about this great event in the history of California, the Portolá Expedition. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.